Back on DoD, sponsored by ProPricer on Federal News Network. And our guest again is Major General Cameron Holt, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting at the Department of the Air Force. And I'm your moderator, Jared Serbu. And before the break, General, you were mentioning that in response to COVID-19, you kind of took the Air Force, or the Department of the Air Force rather, from a peacetime to a wartime footing and turned on all the mechanisms that you would use in wartime. Out of all the things that you learned from COVID, I'm sure some of them are probably really only applicable in that wartime-like footing. But what have you learned that you want to carry forward on a go-forward basis, even in peacetime? I'm sure there are many of those things.
Yeah, there are actually. I mean, we've learned a lot. One of the things right off the top of my head is how powerful a teleworking or a virtual environment really can be. Early on in this, as I mentioned, we couldn't even get on VPN because our networks were so horrible. But the folks that worked that increased those pipes dramatically. So that was one. The second thing was the tools that we use. We're talking on Zoom right now. I don't think before this hit I've ever used Zoom before, or WebEx, or any of those. I mean, I've used Skype before, but not to its fullest extent. And I think that we have rapidly figured out a whole new set of tools to apply to our business that makes us much more efficient. Now, there is a downside there, and that is, frankly, it actually takes more out of you because I may have 12, 14 meetings in a day. At least before I had to walk between meetings at least. Now, not so much. I can leave one topic and pick up on another topic within a minute. There's an increase in productivity, but I think we've got to be measured with that because there's a human cost to that as well. And we just got to be paying attention to that. Another thing I would say that we have learned that I would definitely keep is different approaches to organizational constructs. When you get into an emergency situation where all of the rules associated with a peacetime bureaucracy are gone, and you can start to think outside the box on how would I form an organization that is optimized towards the end states we have to achieve. And so I think, my boss, Dr. Roper, asking me to stand up a task force was absolutely genius, but it also allowed me to stand up like a wartime contracting organization where we don't have to check with any of the stovepiped commands of the Air Force. They're all on board by definition, and we can reach out rapidly to wherever the best experts are, and people roll up their sleeves, immediately operate as a team in a task force construct. Operating organizations around the end states rather than just operating them by functions or by command stovepipes drives tremendous amount of unity of effort that also produces much more rapid results. And I think we could probably apply that construct more than we have in peacetime settings.
Congress did some things around contracting, and you alluded to them in the CARES Act, relaxed some of the requirements around OTAs, allowed you to put more dollars on undefinitized contract actions. As you went through this, was there anything glaring that you wish they had done, or an authority that you wish you had that would have made life easier? I know you had a list as part of the 809 panel that predated this, but anything specific to COVID that you wish Congress had done or should do for future events like this?
Yeah, I think with the contingency authorities turned on, I think that we pretty much had every tool that we needed to operate rapidly. So I wouldn't fault Congress in that. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that the complexity of the documentation in our Cold War acquisition and contracting system is still something that you have to deal with, even if it's after the fact in a contingency environment. And we really have to start understanding that the world has changed since the 1980s. And Congress really needs to take this on for us. The challenge is that there's systemic issues that require some knowledge about the way things are. And there's very few folks that understand that and understand how different things are now from the 1980s. I'll just give you one quick example. In the 1980s, if you had asked somebody on the street, who are the most innovative companies in America, they would tell you, oh, you mean besides the defense industry? Now, if you ask that, nobody would even think of anybody in the defense industry. You know, they would think about Google or Intel or Facebook or somebody else. And there's a tremendous number of startups now in America that frankly don't have any interest in doing business with the Department of Defense because of how unique all of our business processes are. And they're not interested when we put out a solicitation. And those are the people that we have to attract because frankly, some of our adversaries in the world are better at getting them capital investment than we are. And the barriers to entry are simply too high. And now there's 80% of the R&D spending in America is not defense, it's commercial. And if we're going to harness that kind of innovation, we're going to have to start doing business like they do. We're going to have to start recognizing that government is not the biggest player in those marketplaces anymore. In fact, we're not even close to the biggest player in those marketplaces. And so we're going to need authorities from Congress to act with just good judgment, and not as in the paradigm of a 1980s government setting. The last thing I would tell you is, and this applies to COVID, and it applies to emergencies, and it applies to the great power competition. We have got to figure out a way to allow Congress to oversee us without the use of subdivided appropriations down to the gnat's eyelash. We're going to have to provide more funding flexibility in broad portfolios of capabilities and allow for more fungibility between what we invest in execution year. The idea of appropriating a certain dollar for a certain purpose, for a certain program with a certain contractor, immediately destroys our monopsonistic advantage. And it limits the flexibility to such a degree that we can't compete with China or Russia in terms of the speed of decision making that is necessary. And so those are the things that I would say that I would love to have real serious conversations with the staffers on the Hill, not to avoid oversight, but to reinvent oversight.
I want to talk real quickly about pricing here as we start to wind down, because I think the Air Force is probably especially vulnerable to things like sole source situations, especially in the spare parts market, even in the best of times. And so I'm just curious, have you seen many instances during COVID where companies maybe tried to take advantage of the situation, of the urgent needs that you had, to put you in a situation where you felt like you weren't getting fair and reasonable prices?
Yeah, so my answer will be interesting to you. So from the perspective of price gouging and fair and reasonable prices, I haven't seen that as much as I would have expected to see. And that is, that's actually delightful. I mean, I think that's wonderful. It's a testament to some of these contractors and their willingness to actually do something for America. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen that as much as what I expected. What I have seen a ton of, but fortunately we were prepared for it, is a lot of fraudulent companies to begin with. Fraudulent companies, even adversary action to try to get inside of quick decision making.
Was that mainly in that healthcare space that you were mentioning that you don't understand as well?
Overwhelmingly so.
Yeah.
And when I stood up the task force, we actually took a couple of unique approaches to setting up the task force, whereby in the special staff that applied to all 4 lines of effort teams operating, we stood up a market intelligence and vendor vetting cell. And as part of that, we also invited the Air Force Audit Agency to join us in the task force right up front. And so the Air Force Audit Agency was constantly looking at our contracting practices across all 4 lines of effort and advising me and the leads on how we could tighten up our internal controls, even while we were executing, which was really a very innovative way to think about that, rather than waiting until after the fact and then it's too late anyway. It's just the recriminations that go. The second thing is that vendor vetting capability wound up paying off big dividends. And so I don't want to get too much into the details of how we do that, but we were able to vet contractors before we ever did business with them. And we were even able to vet some of the DHHS's contractors for them and quickly advise them on when not to do that deal, when not to award that contract. And one example that I would use that our vendor vetting cell saved the day on, our senior leaders in the Air Force actually got an unsolicited email from a company that looked very credible. They used relationships that they had to be able to send that email. They had documentation attached that was very credible looking, lots of detail and pictures and labs and all the rest of it that showed a lot of deep capabilities. Thank God our leaders had the presence of mind to ask my task force what we thought. And we vetted that contractor, and it turned out that they were not in America, as they said. They were in the Philippines. And frankly, there was some international warrants out for their arrest, and they didn't have financial accounts or anything else. And so we turned off a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse before it ever happened. And so that was very key.
Wanted to wrap up with my last question on the telework aspect of all this that you talked about a little bit, but this is an intense topic of interest for people. General Bunch from Air Force Materiel Command mentioned at a recent event that he's going to start looking through every single one of his civilian position descriptions to figure out if any of those jobs are more conducive to telework than they thought they were when they were written. And he's obviously got a big piece of your contracting workforce. How much of that is going on across the Air Force as far as you can tell? And what's the right way to think about how telework works in a post-COVID environment without, as you said, expecting people to work at the pace they've been working at during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and telework is just one element of it, right? It's how much do you control personnel policies in your organizations? And at what level do you make those decisions? Those, I think, are the better questions to ask, and telework is only a piece of that. And frankly, before this happened, I was already kind of criticized the Air Force that I love, that we had become a little too bureaucratic in that, where a full-time telework decision in some places in the Air Force had to be approved at the 2-star equivalent level. And my own perspective was that should be a supervisor decision, because if the supervisor is accountable for their work product and their people, they're the ones that are best able to make the judgment on whether that kind of work can be done that way and whether the individual is trustworthy enough to handle it. I think now, as we look back after this experience, we had to go with maximum telework. We had to go with innovative organizational designs. We couldn't afford to wait to get that approved through stodgy bureaucratic processes. And guess what? Not only did things not break, in some cases things sped up and got better. And so I think if we don't learn that lesson of how to rethink our organizational designs in a modern way, and discard some of the groupthink of the past, then I would say shame on us. And telework is only one part of that. But even on my own staff, I use telework pretty heavily already. But I just advertised my chief of policy position as able to be full-time telework, where I never would have thought about doing that before.
How much did your attitude change about telework because of this? I don't know what your pre-COVID attitude was, but I think it was a pretty universal view among senior folks in government that if you can't see somebody working, you can't guarantee that they're working.
That wasn't my feeling at all. I
Okay.
was a big supporter of telework. In fact, I was that rabble rouser at the bottom of the hill asking the senior leaders to approve telework for my folks. But I will tell you that in large part, I saw it as a competitive imperative because we were losing a lot of really talented people to organizations that would allow them to full-time telework and have a better work-life balance. And so I looked at it as a competitive imperative for both recruiting and retention of talent. But I would say that you're absolutely correct. I think in retrospect now, there's a lot of minds changing about can we handle that? And to be fair, as I told you, we weren't even allowed to use some of the commercial tools that are out there that actually make telework possible and multiple people collaborating at the same time possible. But you know, so many tools I could name that we have developed where it's really reduced the amount of work we do at all. I mean, some of the status updates that we do now, we just do all in Teams, for example, because once it's there, and it's like a wiki. And if any senior leader in the Air Force wants to see what I'm doing, they can just go look it up in the wiki. I don't have to send them an email or talk to them or anything. And so we're using those tools to their fullest extent when we weren't even able to use them before. So that's, I think, a big paradigm shift as well.
Well, General Holt, you've been very generous with your time, and it's been a great discussion. Thanks very much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Jared, and thank you very much.
Major General Cameron Holt is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting at the Department of the Air Force. I'm your moderator, Jared Serbu, and you are listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search on DoD.